October is the largest indecision month we have seen in Bitcoin's entire history. October 2025. The price is down 18% from the top. We saw a new all-time high and 3 breaks of monthly bottoms in the same month. That's a huge ranging bar. 18%, $22,600 for that entire bar. Now, other months that have seen bigger losses have a decision. They are down or they are very, very up. So big movements in a direction that people can gather what's going on. But this month at the all-time high, and you can see with the closing price coming up in 3 days, has the most amount of indecision that we have seen throughout this entire cycle. And if we just look at it in raw numbers with prices and the pattern of the bar, basically in Bitcoin's entire history. So let's answer a few questions. Because recently, I also dropped another comment saying that Bitcoin won't make it to the end of the 2020s, so basically to 2030. What does that mean? Naturally, you guys are looking for a few more answers, and hopefully we're beginning to develop a few more scientists out of each other here, whereby when we have questions, they are generally met with more questions. So that's natural. Just getting answers is a fool's game. Leave that to the guys who basically make no money and expect that everything is handed to them on a silver platter. So the science is nothing but a series of questions that lead to more questions. A well-educated mind will always have more questions than answers. So that's what I'll look at in today's video, looking at this everything bubble as we lead into the peak of the cycle and then obviously the major collapse if you have been following here on the channel with the 18-year cycle, 18-year US real estate and economic cycle. We are getting into this peak, if not already past the peak or just at the peak in regards to the US real estate and economic cycle. But if we look at something like the stock market, I've said many, many times before, I think there is still further to go. But we do have a few more timing points that may suggest could be coming to a head soonish when you look at the overall cycle being how many years. And with the S&P 500 coming to a peak in its own cycle, I think some of that exuberance in the market may not find its way over into Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies either. And we're beginning to also see a few signs of that, even though this is one of the biggest indecision months that we have seen in its history. So let's start with the bubble in case this is the first time you're seeing things. If it's not, great, bit more revision, and we can hopefully bring up a few more questions here. So the everything bubble, as I've labeled it, is just looking at a majority of the assets continuing to climb higher throughout this real estate cycle, which began roughly 2011, 2012, as you can see from the chart here, 2011, 2012, that's for this cycle. And each price cycle ranges between sort of 17 to 23 years with an average there of about 18.6, which is where the number comes from, and a few other things, but we won't get into that in today's video. Just know that if it's ever referenced 18 to 20 years, it's essentially the same thing here because these are very, very long cycles. So you've got to give or take a year or two here and there, but you can begin to see some of the timing as we get closer towards those peaks with charts that we have been following. For example, the white line here, which is the XHB, the Home Builders ETF, and the market is suggesting, looking forward, that they don't believe at this stage there is going to be too many more profits for the home builders, which could suggest that the land prices may have peaked in the US, which may suggest that we're now on borrowed time, and the rest of this money printing, in the case of the Fed, potentially ending QT relatively soon, or interest rates potentially coming down in the next day or so, which we'll obviously have the answer for very, very soon. Regardless of whether the interest rates come up or down or go sideways, or the Fed ends QT, brings on more QE, or vice versa, the cycle is the cycle and it will continue to repeat. That is the theory that we've been following and I've been sharing with you for years on the channel, especially through those times of the S&P and everything else. You can see with this purple rectangle here, everything going into 2022, and we had this big bear market low. All the fears then were, where is the money going to come from? There's plenty of receipts and stuff that I've posted on X where you can see people's thoughts and comments at the time in 2022 saying it can't go up because X, Y, Z. And a lot of the reasons at the time were regarding there's no more money. QE is stopped, and there's inflation fears, and there's interest rate rises, and yada, yada. So it was always something fearful at the times, yet the cycle found a way to continue to repeat, and it just happens time and time again. So here we are in the bubble with a few of the timing aspects that I've discussed, XHB, and potentially Bitcoin here at these highs, with gold also seeing a high, and of course, part of the everything bubble, the red line, which is the S&P 500 as well. And so that leads me to the timing here for Bitcoin. And we're looking at the 4-year periods, lows to lows, gives us the 4 years. So we're on a weekly chart here. If you look at the timing from the low to the low there, roughly 200 weeks. And obviously you guys can do the maths, 200 divided by 50, obviously 52 weeks, but you get the idea. About 4 years low to low. And you can take a measure of this from any of the cycle lows, low to low point. It's going to be about 200 or so weeks. And I've talked about this particular low before. Some have extended a little further. And here we are in our next one that began in November 2022, which for a 4-year low to low would take us out somewhere in Q4 of 2026. So I'm coming full circle to answer this particular question. Bitcoin won't make it to the end of the 2020s. And there was a lot of comments and then a few other bits and pieces. But the main point here is that I don't think we're going to see a new all-time high price for Bitcoin after this one, potentially, or the next one. And I don't know for the next one because of the S&P 500, wherever this is going to finally peak and end. Obviously, we've been heading higher. And of course, Bitcoin also following suit with the 18-year cycle. So I'll give a couple of options here because there's always going to be questions coming up and we still have a long way to go for before we get to 2030. Therefore, it's pretty hard to say, could this be the top or could we see one more? That's the issue here. And I would say there's a couple of ways to figure this out. If the market, in the case of Bitcoin, if this is the top and we see a breakdown from here because of the other things I've mentioned with the bubble here with the home builders ETF topping out, potentially topping out, of course, we haven't got the final confirmation. We need that to break down from the lows. If that breaks down and then we see the S&P 500 breakdown, I would assume that Bitcoin has already topped out here and it would start to head lower because we know Bitcoin tops before the S&P 500. So if this heads down and we break these lows here, roughly 70,000, 74,000, which is the 50% level of this entire bull market range so far, then I would be much more confident in saying we're unlikely to see a new all-time high price in 2027, 2029. So we got the 4 years from the low to the low. The low, if we look at it in terms of the 4-year cycle, we got the 2022 low. Let's make asses out of you and me. Let's assume we get a low in Q4 of 2026. That's where this red line is here. And so if we do top out here, then we'd probably see a much bigger correction. Therefore, this whole piece would then move down a little bit lower because we've broken some key structures. And by the time Bitcoin consolidates and puts in its accumulation pattern like it has done in previous cycles, so I'm just moving this down so you can get a bit more of a visual representation here. You can see it's done the accumulation. That's taken roughly a year. You can see from the June low, then we had a November low, March higher low, June higher low, September slightly higher low, a year, 15 months. By the time that occurs from Q4 in 2026, that would then take you out to possibly Q1 of 2028. Therefore, you're probably going to be in the midst of the 18-year cycle collapse. So 2028, 2029 is probably going to be the most difficult times of the cycle. Now that's depending on the final confirmation that the home builders and a few other metrics that we follow have topped. That's for the national US real estate prices. So if all that stuff is topped and it is in the process of coming down. That's an if, of course. If it's in the process, then we could probably say, look, we're somewhere around the tops here for 2025, 2026 across many markets, leaving gold aside for now. Therefore, Bitcoin may have topped here, or maybe, you know, we get another top within Q4 and it starts to head down altogether. And then that next rally up is probably going to be weaker because the rest of the market is looking a little weaker. And then by the time we get to the 4-year cycle peak, which historically has been 4 years. So you can see 4 years from the top to the top. There's 2021, here's 2025, 2017, 2013. So if we measure out, naturally you'd think 2029, here's 2029, that's looking at September. So Q3, Q4 of 2029, then I would think that this is going to be lower. And so if that is lower, then we may be in the midst of putting in the all-time high for this decade, the final all-time high for this decade. Again, it could go a little bit higher for this period, Q4, Q1 of 2026, so Q4 25, Q1 2026, because we don't have confirmation of this top yet. Once we do have confirmation of a potential top here for this cycle, then we can get a better reading on where this next leg moves. And that hopefully answers the comment here. Bitcoin won't make it to the end of the 2020s, meaning that we won't see a new all-time high price in the next 4-year cycle, if of course we've now seen the all-time high for Bitcoin here, or potentially in the next few months. So I think that's something important to cover, especially if we're looking to build up our positions for that next leg. If you can get the price low enough, say Bitcoin does fall from these highs, and naturally that leads to the next question. You know, we've seen 70 to 90% corrections in the past. Will we see another 70 to 90% correction for Bitcoin? I think it's probably unlikely a 90% correction. 90% from the current high would take you past the previous cycle low. So let's call that a no. We're not going to see a sub $15,000 Bitcoin. At least I don't think so. 90%, where's that? 12 grand. Pretty unlikely. 80% correction takes you somewhere around 24, 25. So somewhere back to those previous lows. That's obviously assuming that the top is in. I mean, that's possible. It seems a little bit low at this stage, but you know, we can't argue with bear markets, and when you're in the midst of them, they can keep going lower than most people expect. And so then if we look towards the previous highs, that's a roughly 75% correction. And then some other support and resistance areas, you've got roughly the 50K area. That's about a 60% correction. So I think somewhere in the vicinity of about 60% to 75% would seem pretty normal for Bitcoin, especially after putting in a 700% move to the upside. So you got your 15K low, you got your 126K top, 715%. And you've got a bit of a gap here between 25K and 50K where the price really did run through that relatively quickly. So if you did find Bitcoin anywhere down into that area between 60 and 75% correction, your $30,000 to $50,000 range, then sure, it's probably not a bad area for some sort of buy the dip opportunity or some sort of Bitcoin accumulation through that region. But for that next 4-year cycle, it might be a bit tough going, because obviously my view is that we'd be entering the collapse period of the 18-year cycle. You know, your cycle peak has occurred. We see the crash, and then it's going to take many, many years to get to that recovery. I don't think it's going to be anything like a mid-cycle slowdown where things just drop off for a year or so and then come back. That's what we've seen in prior mid-cycles. Here is the chart here, mid-cycles going to 2020. 2001, that was also a couple of years down. 1981, that ran into 1982. So yeah, again, another year or so down. 1961, and you can keep counting this thing back as well from that point. So that's a look at the next sort of 5 or so years, taking you through the next 4-year cycle. On the flip side, should we see this market run higher? So what if we go from this point and things really do start to take off? We see the correction that comes in, and then Bitcoin starts to move higher for this cycle. So I'll have to not worry about the dates, the timing down here. then we could probably expect a little bit more of a higher low formation above the critical area, which I think is starting to show up around 70K, depending on where this top comes in. And then we can start to look for any signs of a new all-time high for that next 4-year cycle, which is a long way off at this point, but we're going to have to reassess should that time come. And then we have a look at where those lows come in for that 4-year. We know the 4-year is roughly a low to be expected in the second half of 2026. Now, I know this is a whole lot of speculation. It's a whole lot of ifs and thens and whatevers, right? We don't have the confirmation yet, but at least I've got 2 points here. And then I can start to ask more questions if those things happen. And those ifs, again, for clarity, are do we see the final top now, or is there going to be another higher high for Bitcoin in this cycle? Then we can start to assess where those next points come in and whether we get to these all-time highs for the next 4-year cycle, or is the next 4-year cycle going to be a bit of a shit show and the price just not go any higher? Basically end up with a lower low that then runs into an even lower low price come roughly 2030s, the early 2030s, before the whole thing starts again. And we've seen that before on the NASDAQ. So we've seen the NASDAQ run into new all-time high prices, and this was like the dot-com boom of 2000, or obviously the 90s into 2000. And then the lower high form in late 2000, and then of course it dumped into 2002. And that next rally was very, very low. It did not even make 50% of that prior move. So this was a huge, huge blow off top move. And you can see with the 50% back in 2022, it barely made the 50% there, or it didn't even, it was so far away from it. But the beauty about that is that you got into a higher low in 2008, 2009, and then the market started to take off from that point. So there is still a silver lining to the end. It's just a matter of how long do you have in your investing career? Do you have enough money to hold on for that period? Do you have enough patience? Do you have enough skill? Have you been learning enough about your cycle analysis and how you can hang into the game through these pretty difficult times? And with this, so these huge, huge moves, I think there are some more difficult times coming up, but there's no point in bucking the trend now because, well, of course, it's running into new all-time high prices. It would be absolutely stupid to try and short this thing all the way up like the perma bears do. The perma bears are always looking for a reason to dump the market. And I've talked about before why I think this has got a lot further to go because of things like retesting prior highs, which we did in April of this year. You can see the low here in early April, came back and tested some of the lows, some of the previous all-time highs, and has since run away. And it was similar to what happened with the dot-com boom in the late 90s, which peaked out in 2000, where you see a lot of retesting. This was an absolute monster, mega pump. Like it's a bubble already, and it's only 1998. You could even call it a bubble in 95, which they did, 97, late 97, then 98, and then you see the thing just keeps going. But through this earlier part, you can see the market retesting, and then it starts to run away and no more retesting of those previous highs. So getting a bit of a balance act between the buyers and the sellers. Everyone's basically on the buy side, and it just booms into those highs, and then of course collapses. Look where it collapses to, right back to the previous top from the point where the market stopped testing those highs. And then, of course, it went on for a little further, but notice the big initial, well, the biggest drawdown of that entire period was all the way back to the breakout point. You've got one big one at the top, complacency bounce, and then all the way back to the top where the market first broke out. So here we are again, market on its run. Do we start to see this thing blow up like it did in the pattern of the late 90s, and we see even further gains? That could be a saving grace here for Bitcoin in this cycle, and the top may not be in, of course. But in terms of the short-term analysis, just for a quick update, we haven't seen anything yet from BTC apart from a couple of failures here at the 50% level and a few more days to the downside. So Bitcoin, if it can hold out here between 108 and 110, we have another chance of taking a test at 115, which could put this back into a nice stronger position. For now, it's in a slightly weaker position. And according to the other metrics that I've been following for you guys here on the channel, I'm still macro bullish because we haven't broken down yet, but a lot of those signs are still present. There are still present signs that things are weakening for Bitcoin at this time. Stuff like USDT dominance, even with more stable coins being printed, and of course the dominance going up here, it hasn't changed over the years. The stable USDT has been printed the entire history, yet it's been going down in its dominance because people have been using it to go and speculate on Bitcoin and cryptos. Why aren't they doing that now? That's kind of the question that will be answered in due course. But what we can see from the chart is that they are choosing day by day, week by week to hold USDT more so than Bitcoin, ETH, altcoins. And you can see that forming here on those higher lows. In the last couple of days, we saw another move higher back to try and test the 5 and 5.1%. We need to see for the bull market breakdown of 4.6%. Otherwise, we are pretty much following a very similar pattern to 2021, where we saw high lows, and then the dominance just take off. And of course, Bitcoin and crypto collapse from that point. Now, we don't have the longer term confirmation. The shorter term stuff is leaning onto the bearish side, which we can see in the chart of Bitcoin. It's been rejected again at the 50% level right here. And it's had a few attempts there. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, attempted it a few times, and now we're starting to come back, probably come and test this 50% around 110. Ideally, we don't break the lows there at 107, 108. So it's a bit of a different video today, looking more long-term for Bitcoin, for stock markets, for real estate, because that's what we do day in and day out at the Investor Accelerator. It's what I do full time. Looking at my portfolio, understanding where the market is moving, or attempting to understand that, of course, asking more questions about it, and then looking to rotate my capital into different markets for those times of the 18-year cycle. So far, it has done us very, very well. You've seen that online on YouTube. You've seen it on X as well with a lot of those posts. Not everything works out 100%, but as long-term investors, the name of the game is to continue to make profits, and provided you can do that, well, you're going to stay in the game longer than everyone else. And so if I think we got this thing coming up here, that's going to be the next important space to watch: the peak and the collapse of the 18-year cycle. How does Bitcoin play into this? Is it going to follow the narratives of interest rates cutting and the end of QE and more money printing going on? That is yet to be decided. I know many people have made up their minds about that already with global liquidity, but I think it's way too early to just bet on the fact that things are going to go up forever. If they don't go up when we get this money printing, that would be probably one of the biggest news failures that we could see this entire cycle. Like and subscribe to the channel if you want to keep following the journey. Otherwise, join us on the wait list for our next intake of the Investor Accelerator, and of course the reports that are coming out to you today as well for Bitcoin and the economy. See you guys back in the next video. Until then, take care and peace out.